My name is Amelia Glazer. I am the director of the Jewish Studies program, and I'm so pleased to introduce Haim Weiss and Mira Balberg. Getting people to the room. Just a reminder for those of you who have just entered, we will keep people muted for the duration of the talk, and there will be a question and answer session at the end. For question and answer, there are a few different ways of asking a question. If you have a burning desire to ask something as you are hearing Professors Weiss and Balberg speak, please feel free to go ahead and enter it in the chat at any point. We've enabled the chat so that you can do that. Some people prefer that sort of thinking, but you're also welcome to raise your hand. You can either raise your little yellow hand by using the reactions that you see at the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your actual hand, and I will do my best to call on you. We'll make sure that we get to everyone, and there will be a little bit of time right at the end if you just want to chat. We'll kind of simulate the coming up at the end of a talk in the lecture hall to introduce yourselves to the speakers. So there will be a less formal moment for that after we have stopped the recording. So right now, it gives me so much pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Mira Balberg, as well as Professor Haim Weiss, who have co-authored, and I don't actually have a copy of my book in front of me, but they are co-authors of this book, and we'll be speaking about it for you now. And I will just say a couple of words about each of the speakers. Mira Balberg is a professor of history, as well as the endowed chair in ancient Jewish civilizations at UC San Diego. And she specializes in ancient Mediterranean religions with a focus on the emergence and development of Judaism in antiquity. And that antiquity in this understanding is from around 200 of the before the Common Era to about 500 of the Common Era. Professor Balberg is the author of Petach Lesifrut Hazal, which might be translated Gateways to Rabbinic Literature. And that came out in Israel through the Open University of Israel Press in 2013. She is also the author of Purity, Body, and Self in Early Rabbinic Literature, which came out with the University of California Press in 2014, and of Blood for Thought, the reinvention of sacrifice in early rabbinic literature, which also came out with the University of California Press in 2017. Professor Haim Weiss is Associate Professor of Hebrew Literature at Ben Gurion University in Israel. He specializes in rabbinic literature, midrash, and folklore. He also specializes in the relations between classical Jewish literature and modern Hebrew literature. Weiss is the author of All Dreams Follow the Mouth, a reading in the Talmudic Dream Tractate, which came out with Ben Gurion University Press in 2011, and the co-author, together with Shira Stav, of The Return of the Missing Father, a new reading in a chain of stories from the Babylonian Talmud, which came out in 2018. So today, Mira and Haim will be discussing When Near Becomes Far, old age in rabbinic literature. I'm so excited about this book and excited to hear them speak about this co-authorship. I also wanted to comment that, Haim, we would have been so happy to have you here in person with us. I got to meet Haim very briefly, I think, at Mandeville Coffee Cart when the two of you were just finishing your book project a couple of years ago. And so I'm hoping that in the future we can welcome you to campus again in the flesh. But without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to Haim and Mira.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amelia, for this introduction. Thank you, Anna Marie, for putting this event together. And thank you all for joining us in a somewhat unconventional time of day. Usually our events are in the afternoon, but we're meeting at the morning California time because Haim is joining us from Israel. And this is also the opportunity to thank Haim for joining us from this distance and for co-authoring this book with me. So as Amelia mentioned, we are really pleased to celebrate with you our new book, which is called When Near Becomes Far, Old Age in Rabbinic Literature, that was just published with Oxford University Press about a month ago. And this book is really sort of the fruit of a collaboration between the two of us. I'm coming from the direction of cultural history of ancient Judaism. Haim comes from the study of literature in sort of Jewish literature more generally. And we really thought that the best way and perhaps the most interesting way to tell you about the book is by having kind of a conversation between us, in which we will tell you each how we got to this project, to the questions that interest us, and then each of us will read a really, really short text. You'll be surprised to see just how short, that will demonstrate a little bit the kind of work that we do in the book, and then we'll be happy to open it up for questions. So let me start by sharing my screen. And one sec. Just to show you the book itself, we really, really love the cover. So we take the opportunity to show that when we can. The beautiful artwork on the cover was actually designed by a colleague and a friend, Shira Stav, a colleague of Haim from Gurion University's Department of Literature, who is also a gifted photographer and a poet. And you can sort of see Shira's poetic talent in the picture. We really felt that it captures something beautiful about the book. Just a little bit of an explanation about the title. And let me start with the subtitle, Old Age in Rabbinic Literature. So 2 words about what we mean by rabbinic literature. We're talking about the array of compositions that were created by the Jewish elite group that we call the rabbis, more or less between the 2nd and 6th centuries CE of the Common Era in Palestine, and also Roman Palestine, and also in Babylonia. This is the group that really created the most of the Jewish literature that survived from this period. There's a lot of different compilations there, Mishnah, Midrash, and other things, but probably the most famous work of rabbinic literature is the Babylonian Talmud, which most people just call the Talmud. And in this particular book, we really engage primarily with the Babylonian Talmud, and the examples we will give will be from the Babylonian Talmud. The main title of the book is taken from a little story that appears in the Babylonian Talmud, in which one rabbi asks the other rabbi, "Why did you not come to visit me during the festival, during the holiday?" And the other rabbi pretty much wants to say, I couldn't come because I'm too old for this right now. But he gives a very poetic answer, or he renders his old age in a poetic way. So as the anecdote goes, Rabbi Judah the patriarch said to Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, "For what reason did we not greet you during the festival the way my fathers greeted your fathers?" And the answer is, "Rocks became high, near became far, 2 became 3. That which brings peace to the household is no more." So 2 became 3 is 2 legs turning into 3 with the cane, that famous riddle of the Sphinx image. And that which brings to the peace to the household is no more is probably a reference to sexual desire. If we can understand it from the title, you can already see that this is a somewhat grim depiction of old age. But we really felt that this phrase "near became far" or "near becomes far" is this beautiful capturing not just of distances getting longer in old age, and perhaps eyesight and hearing also changing, but something also about some of the social elements of the experiences of old age that we felt that we were kind of set in a poignant way in this regard. So what we really wanted to kind of put out there immediately is that this book is about old age as a cultural phenomenon, which means that what interests us is how the creators of this literature, the rabbis, thought about old age. So the book is not concerned with old age as a demographic experience or from like a history of medicine type of angle, but really as a topic that people think about, as a biosocial phenomenon insofar as people are responding and creating myths and creating stories and representing old age. And exactly because of this, the book really needed this collaboration of a person who comes from the angle of history and a person who comes from the angle of literature. So the first thing I want to do is really turn to Haim and ask him to tell us about what it means to read rabbinic literature as literature, to read it as a literary scholar, because for the most part, people don't approach it that way. They think of it as sort of a didactic literature that seeks to teach us lessons about how to live a good life. So can you tell us about how you work with rabbinic literature as literature?
First of all, good evening or good morning. I don't know, it's evening here. And I wanted to apologize for dragging you so early in the morning, but it's evening here. And I want to thank Anna Marie and Emilia, and of course, Mira. The topic might be not so much fun or something like that, but working on the book was a lot of fun. I don't know how to describe it, but it was an intellectual challenge, and working with Mira is one of the greatest presents I ever had. So thank you. And I want to say something about reading literature as literature. Usually when we approach religious texts, we tend or we expect to find some kind of, as Mira said, didactical messages, or they want to teach us something, they want to educate us, they want to tell us how to do things or how to behave or to behave nicely. When I was a kid, since I grew up in a very ultra-Orthodox family, so we had a lot of books with rabbinic stories, and my parents used to read them for me every night before going to sleep, and all those stories were didactic, very didactic. You know, help the poor people, help old age people, help your parents, behave nicely, and all kind of those things. And when I really started to read rabbinic literature, one of the first things that I found out is rabbinic literature doesn't want to be didactic. There's some kind of something inside that literature that refuses to behave nicely, if I can say something like that. And we can read rabbinic literature from all kind of angles and approaches, and historians would read it to find some kind of historical material, and I don't know, people who deal with language would do what they are doing, but I want to read rabbinic literature as literature. And there to read, I don't know, the different characters, to find out what they want to do, what they feel, what are their desires, how they manage themselves in the world. Now, the rabbinically, when you read rabbinic stories or literature, you find that the stories are very, very, very short. You would hardly find any kind of reference to emotions, for instance. They would not say, he went out, the rain fell, there was a heavy storm, and he thought for himself, I'm such a poor man, everything is going wrong. They would just say somebody died or something like that, and you will have to find out what happened there. It's a very short literature, very condensed literature, and it turns usually, as you can say, it's interested in psychological, I don't know, the psychological infrastructure of the stories or of the heroes or the people in the stories. It usually, and usually when you understand or you read it as very short stories that focuses on the psychological, I don't know, dilemma or problem or challenge, you read it and so all of a sudden you find something strange in the story, something that is not meant to be there. Because since those are such short stories, you pay attention to any kind of excess or excessive materials that are in the stories and are not supposed to be there. Something strange. And usually when you start reading rabbinic literature like that, you find almost in every story something that is not supposed to be there. A small detail, a small, I don't know, a pillow all of a sudden appear in a story. We have a great story about that we discuss in the book about the emerge of, or the flea of Rav Kahana from Babylonia to Palestine, to Eretz Israel. And he's meeting there Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was an old, very respectable sage. He was the head of the academy at Tiberias. And the story is complicated, but they are arguing or debating halachic or legal discussions. And all of a sudden, the story tells you that Rabbi Yochanan sat on the top of 7 pillows. Now, the story doesn't need those pillows, but they are there. And when you I don't know, insist of understanding why the story put the pillows there, you can turn the story from its didactical, I don't know, trajectory or thrust to something else. You can ask different questions or you can look at the story differently. Now, we know, Mira and I know that when we are doing it, we might be accused of what people call overreading the story, because we insist of fully understanding why those little things are in the story. Now, we'll probably get to that later on, but when we approach the stories, and Mira, you can, I don't know, if we want to talk about it later, so it's okay, but when we approach the stories about old age in rabbinic literature, usually when you look for direct discussions or when the rabbis are approaching or dealing directly with old age, it's very didactical. They're doing it the right way. They're saying the right things about old age. You have to respect the elderly. Sometimes they can say it's not nice, it's unhappy, it's complicated to be old. And we couldn't find much or a lot of material to work with. But when we start looking at stories that are not dealing directly with old age, but old age is like the excessive material in the story, that this little thing that is not supposed to be there, but it's there because they wanted to add some kind of another layer to the story. They are not just interested in focusing in the didactical or religious message of the story. They want to tell us, we are not saying that the didactical message is not there. We are interested in the other layer, in the extra layer that they are adding to the story, in which they are telling us another story, a story about old people, a story about all kinds of things, but we insist on looking at those things and fully understand them to our best ability or something like that. So that's, maybe Mira want to add something to that, but that's in a nutshell what we see in rabbinic stories or something like that.
So, yeah, you're bringing us really to why we chose to write about old age. And the thing is that, let's maybe start from our own context. You know, I think that we live in a society, even in 2021, we live in a society in which old age is to a certain extent denied. And this is something that many people who study old age actually commented about, that for as long as, you know, elderly people are still functioning in society like ordinary adults, it is just a silenced topic. When people start emerging out of the social order in the context of old age, they are often seen as just irrelevant. They're sort of emerging out of the way people talk about it in general. And that was something that we were very interested in, because Haim mentioned that in order to read rabbinic stories that are so short, you need to be very, very aware of excess. You need to be aware of the things that it's not entirely clear why they're there. I'm going to say something a little bit bold, and that is, I think that as a society, we treat old age as a form of excess. We don't know how to contain it. We see it as a form of like, okay, well, what do you do with people who have gotten older? And I don't think our society has been able to give answers to that anymore. That is, I think, one of the things that really interests us. Now, many people who knew that we were working on this topic asked us, oh, but it must have been, if you're working on antiquity, that being old was completely different then. Then old people were respected, old people were appreciated. Of course, people didn't live as long as they do today to a great extent. But the reason that we found rabbinic literature so compelling is that the picture of old age that emerges from rabbinic text is actually incredibly complicated and psychologically layered. Because of those small moments in texts that don't seem like they're talking about old age, that they're officially about something else, but old age appears in them, we're able to see a lot of complexity. So why do you think, Haim, that nobody wrote about that? Why is it that rabbinic texts are actually very preoccupied with old age, especially the Babylonian Talmud, but you really have to dig in and kind of strip the stories from their didactic lining, as you described it, in order to talk about it?
So you can divide the question or my thoughts about, I don't know, there may be two answers to it. First, there's not much, as you said, there's not much direct material about old age in rabbinic literature. You have to dig it. You have to look in corners. You have to look where they hit old age in rabbinic literature, and you have to find those stories in which they are not dealing directly with old age. And all of a sudden you have this magnificent picture, complicated, rich, sad, happy, funny, mourning even, about all that. They have all of it is there, and you just have to dig it. But in the, I don't know, in the last like 30 years or so, rabbinic scholars in general turn, they start looking at question of gender. They start looking at questions of body representation. They start asking cultural questions. The path that used to have been taken, like the historical philological path that usually was the high or the main road of studying rabbinic literature, it was not replaced, but it was widened with questions of cultural meaning, of how we represent. But usually when we ask question about body, we are looking at the fertile body, the body that is still, we consider sexual body, or we consider it we don't like to look at old age. It's considered, in a way, and I'll be happy if you'll add something to it, it's considered to be something not interesting. And in a different level, or in a deeper level, people are afraid of working or dealing with old age. Because, okay, the reasons are obvious, but you cannot, it's harder to be ambivalent about old age, or it's hard to look at old age from, it's considered, I'll be bold over here, I'm sorry, but it's considered something like the last station or something like that, and people do not like to look at it or to study it, and they prefer, when they are dealing with old age, to deal with it as people told us. They probably respected their old people. They probably thought their old people to be smart, wise, generous. They were taking care of them, and all those things are probably right, but there are much more in rabbinic literature about old age, and you have to look at it, and people do not like or prefer not to look at it.
So I see that we already got some requests for examples. So maybe we will share just a couple of examples to show you the kinds of materials we've been working on, and then maybe say a couple more words and then open it up to your questions. So each of us chose one very short text that we're discussing in the book. And I think you will be, if you're not familiar with rabbinic text, I think you will be a little bit shocked when we're saying short, just how short we're talking about.
Very
short. But there's a lot there. Rabbinic stories are like Zen koans. Like you read them, and then every time you find things you didn't see before. So I'll start by, I'll share a story, and then Haim will share one of his. Sorry. Okay. So the very short story I will be discussing, everybody hopefully can see it, is from Tractate Tubot of the Babylonian Talmud. And the story concerns a debate about weddings and the customs of weddings. And there is a tradition in the Talmud that you're supposed to dance before the bride. This is one of the nice mitzvot that you can do, make the bride and the groom happy. And this is a story about an old man who used to dance before brides, but he did it in a somewhat unusual way. So here it is. Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak used to dance before brides on 3. We are told that he used to, it is in a previous statement, he used to hold a branch of myrtle, which was always used in weddings, dance with this branch, but he would do it on 3. What does 3 mean? It probably means on 3 legs, which suggests that this old man is using a cane and is basically has his own 2 legs and another one to go, the cane that goes with it. Rabbi Zera said, the old man shames us. So Rabbi Zera is looking at Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, who's dancing, and he responds to this by saying, this old man shames us. Then Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak died. When his soul went to rest, this is Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, when his soul went to rest, a pillar of fire separated between him and the rest of the world. And we learned that a pillar of fire does not separate this way except for 1 person in a generation or 2 in a generation. So after this old dancer dies, Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, there is this recognition, a heavenly recognition, that he was an especially righteous person because this pillar of fires comes out of the sky and separates his beer, his funerary beer, from the rest of the people. And we know that this is something very exceptional, which means he was super extra righteous. Rabbi Zera, who said, oh, this old man shames us, then responds in a way that the Talmud cannot quite decide what it was. Basically, Rabbi Zera says, oh, this pillar of fire is probably an indication that that dancing before brides that I thought was shameful was actually a righteous action. But what is Rabbi Zera exactly saying? There's 3 versions. One version is that he said the old man's branch benefited him. Branch is shutite in Aramaic. And some say the old man's foolishness, shtute, benefited him. And some say the old man's habit, shitate, benefited him. So it's 3 very similar words in Aramaic. And basically the Talmud, the editors of the Talmud, if you will, are arguing what it was that Rabbi Zera actually said. Did he say that it was the habit of Rabbi Shmuel that benefited him? Was it his foolishness? Was it the branch, the myrtle branch that he used? Or maybe the cane that he was using? Another possible interpretation. So on the face of it, on the surface, a story about, oh, you do nice things, you try to make the bride and the groom happy, and you are rewarded and you're a righteous man, even if people think that you're a little bit silly. But if we are turning our attention specifically to the dynamics around old age here, so many questions come up. What does it mean when Rabbi Zera says, the old man shames us? Why is he ashamed by the behavior of this older person? What is it about the dance? The dance itself is completely legitimate. The Talmud says that it's a good thing to dance before a bride. So what is it that makes it questionable? Why is Rabbi Zera ashamed because of it? Does he think that people who are rabbis, people who study the Torah, should not be behaving this way? Is he thinking that perhaps a man who is disabled, a man who is using a cane, should not be dancing this way? Something about that disordered body is making him uncomfortable. And that is perhaps the moment to add that Rabbi Zera was probably not born with the name Rabbi Zera. Zera means small one, tiny one. It was probably a name, and a somewhat mocking name, that this particular rabbi got because he was very short. And in some other texts, he is even called the one with burned calves. It seems like Rabbi Zera himself had some kind of a disability. So what is it about a younger man who is apparently has his own issues about his body, who is saying about an older man, he shouldn't be dancing, he shouldn't be showing up? And why the lack of ability to decide what is it that Rabbi Zera actually said in the end? Did he say this was a foolishness, but apparently benefited him? Was it just a good habit? Was I wrong about this? So this is a very, very minimalist story, but it encapsulates a certain kind of tension around old age and around the old body and around the dynamics of a younger person looking at an older person, and perhaps sees himself, perhaps sees the things that he doesn't like about his own body, perhaps being concerned about what is the appearance of old age. And I think that these are dynamics that we know that have to do with those intergenerational communications. So again, this is an example of something that may look very didactic, but actually has a lot of tensions related to aging and the aging body that are familiar to us. So that's one example. And Haim, if you will share one example as well.
Yeah. What? Yeah. So my story is even shorter than Mira's story, and I'll read it, and then now this is one of those stories that at first glance seems very didactic, very nice story about respecting your parents, and then when you start asking questions about like why they're doing it or what really happens there, the whole structure collapses. And I'll read the story. Rabbi Tarfon had that old mother, and every time she wanted to climb into her bed, she would stoop and he would stoop and let her up. And every time she would step out of her bed, she would step down on him. He went and was praising himself at the study house. And they told him, "You have not even reached half of the honor that one is supposed to confer on one's parent. Did she ever throw not your wallet in front of you into the sea and you did not disgrace her?" Now, this story has a Palestinian parallel in which the sand of the mother is torn and the son is putting his hands under her feet and escorting her back to her house or her bed and making sure that she's not injured. And the Palestinian version of the story makes some kind of sense, okay? He wants to keep his mother from being injured. But here, and as I told you, I was told as a child hundreds of times the stories by my mother. She had, of course, an interest in it, about the son who's putting his hands under the feet of his mother. But this story is, it's not it's completely different, because you have so many questions to ask about the story, about the excess material in the story, the basic question that you have to ask about this story, and from that question emerges a complicated picture about old age and especially old mothers. The question is why he is doing what he is doing, why he is performing or submitting himself as a stool. His mother is climbing, she's practically walking on him, okay? It's not a metaphor. She is climbing on him to her bed and going down from her bed on him. And the picture is very vivid. You can imagine Rabbi Tarfon is a very meaningful and respectable member of the rabbinic community. And each time he's going home to his mother, he's laying on the floor and his mother is walking all over him and climbing to her bed. Now she can buy, or he can, I don't know, buy for her a stool. So why he's doing it and what kind of relationship? I don't want to answer those questions. I'm just presenting the questions. What kind of relationship is, I don't know, formed between a mother that steps all day long on her son? Now, this is one story in a chain of a very interesting, a long chain of stories about stories that deal with honoring your parents, the law that the law from the Torah that you have to respect and honor your parents. And all the stories, in all the stories, you have fathers, or in most of the stories, the fathers are sleeping all the time. They're old, they're in bed, they're sleeping. Their sons are afraid to wake them up. or something like that. And the mothers are always on a move. Here too in the story, the mother never sleeps. She's climbing to the bed, she's going up to the bed, she's going down from the bed, she's always on the move, and she's always stepping or climbing on her son. So the first question is, what kind of, I don't know, what kind of relationship, or I won't say sadistic, but it's some kind of, I don't know, I don't know many people who are doing something like that. But if the story would have stopped or end after the first paragraph, in which the son is doing what he's doing, the mother is climbing to the bed, we could say, okay, it's a bit strange, but still they want to demonstrate, or they want to emphasize the level of how much you have to respect, because you have to understand, not the Torah and not the rabbinic law explains exactly or give a measure of how much you have to respect your parents, or when do you reach, when enough is enough. Okay, when it's, so the stories are going that the parents are becoming very demanding old people, and the sons, their children are trying to fulfill their complicated and sometimes weird questions or desires. Now here, if the story would have ended after the first paragraph, we'd say, okay, this is some kind of extreme example for respecting your parents, and that's it. But he is going to the study house, and he's praising himself, like as if he want to reverse the power structure in the story. At the first part of the story, he is under his mother. Now he's going back to the study house, where he's a strong, respectable member of the study house, and he is telling everybody, yeah, what a good boy am I, or something like that. I'm a great son. Look what I'm doing. In the Palestinian Talmud, actually, the mother is going to the study house, and she is praising her son. But the answer of the students, or the answer of his peers, his fellow rabbis, is interesting. They're not saying to him, yeah, you are a great son. We should all go and, I don't know, let our mothers walk all over us. Let's all do that. They're saying that's not. They actually said it's nothing. Did your mother took your wallet, or a wallet? It depends on the manuscript, and throw it to the sea in front of everybody, and you didn't say anything. So what they're saying, the fact that you are humiliating yourself in a private sphere, it's nice, but you have to do it in a public sphere. You have to let your mother become something like crazy, or act crazy, and let everybody see it, watch it, and you have to accept her, or not say, at least not say anything, or not scorn her or something like that. And then you might get to the level that is required from respecting your parents. So, and this is a short story and a short example in which you can understand the complexity of relationship between old people, especially parents, and their sons, and the way in which rabbinic literature, they're not talking about it directly, but when you start asking questions like why, or why the story is telling us that story, and why there's a difference between the Palestinian story, which is nicer in a way, and the Babylonian story, then you can start seeing the complexity of relationship between old and young people, especially inside the family.
Okay, so this is just, these are two very short examples. That the thing is, each of us could talk about them probably for another hour. And we also got some fantastic comments and questions in the chat about them that just go to show you how, from some of our rabbinicist friends. So you can see that we are all trained to take those little things and try to think about them as much as we can. But I want to use these two examples to demonstrate two very important things about this literature. In the story that I talked about, one of the things that is at stake is the fact that the rabbis pretend that they are an ageless community. Because this is a community that very much focuses on intellectual excellence, that focuses on study culture, focuses on exchange of opinions and sort of the alacrity of the mind, you will find a lot of references that age in the context of amongst the rabbis themselves doesn't matter. All that matters is, your wisdom, and all that matters is what you can say, and all that matters is the arguments you make. And as a matter of fact, the word zaken, elder, is actually sometimes used to say rabbi, which is an interesting thing. This is kind of the dynamics of, on the one hand, trying to show that age is extremely important and it's a source of great respect in the rabbinic community, but also that it doesn't matter. Anybody can be an elder if they're wise. The story of Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, the old man who's dancing, and Rabbi Zera is an indication to you that this is not quite so simple. This is not a situation in which age does not matter. Younger rabbis are looking at older rabbis and are thinking, they're kind of really behaving, they're a little, I'm going to say bluntly, they're a little senile. Maybe they're making us not look so good. What are people thinking when they see these old rabbis disgracing themselves? We also have stories from the opposite angle of older rabbis who are afraid of letting go. Older rabbis who are not letting younger rabbis find a place in the system, make a significant contribution, are trying to actually quiet them down and suppress them in a certain way. So the relationship in the study house are much more complex than meets the eye. The example that Haim talked about, which is taken from a chapter of our book in which we discuss the issue of older children or adult children and their older parents, is, I think, one of the richest examples that we have, because of course the sort of open or the overt message is, yes, of course, when your parents get older, you need to respect them deeply. You need to do everything for them. You need to answer each one of their requests. And your parents are like God. This is a common trope that, and respecting your parents like respecting God. But then there's also stories about parents actually abusing that to a certain extent and creating those very problematic situations in which you're not sure that responding to each one of their whims is quite the right thing. So there is a lot of complexity and a lot of ambivalence. And I think the reason why we enjoyed working with this literature so much is that behind that very kind of overt didactic message, which is what you would look for if you would kind of superficially try to say, well, what do the rabbis say about old age? You'll see that all the perspectives are there. The perspectives of younger people are there. The perspectives of older people are there. The fears of losing your status, losing your bodily composure, losing your sexual attractiveness, those are very much there. The fear of not being given a place because, older people are actually insisting and sometimes can be very rigid toward younger people are also there. So from the direction for me as a cultural historian, I think that this is an amazing opportunity to really look at what we call, the biosocial elements of old age. How are the biological processes of old age, which are, undeniable, relating to social roles, to social understandings, to the explanations of what can older people contribute to society or what can they not? And rabbinic texts are actually more open about this than most ancient texts that we have encountered, which is why writing this book was so enjoyable. So we've spoken for about 45 minutes, and at this point, we'll just be really happy to respond to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much.
Before I take questions, just please join me in thanking both Professor Weiss and Professor Balberg for this wonderful presentation and this book, which is just fantastic and will be received in so many different areas. I'm struck, especially by these examples, by your treatment of the physical as well as the psychological elements of aging, and also of being a child of someone who might be aging, and that, you know, that very complex relationship that evolves. And I want to now open the floor to questions. We have several in the chat, but what I'd like to ask you all to do is go ahead and raise, you know, either hand. It'll be easier to see your yellow hand because that will show up as a person who has a question. And to find that, you just want to go down on my screen. It's the bottom right-hand side. You open reactions and you should see a little space there that says raise hand. So if you're on a normal laptop computer, that's a very easy way to ask a question. Otherwise, you can either say, I have a question in chat, or you can, you know, wave your hands around and try to get our attention. But I'll keep track of the people who have questions in order, and we'll begin with the chat, if that is okay with everyone. I want to start with Julia Watts-Belser, who had a question early on in the conversation. Julia writes, it really resonates with me, this wonderful point about finding stories that aren't about old age, but where issues of aging appear, perhaps unexpectedly or on the side. I'd love to know more about your process, about finding these stories and surfacing this material.
So I'll just start by saying that it's really a joy to see Julia here, because I think, you know, in the earlier, we were mentioning the fact that the study of the body in rabbinic culture was something that was very, very neglected, because mostly I think people sort of stuck to a very Foucauldian paradigm that the body is sexuality and the disabled body is a suffering body. All of those things really did not get much attention. And Julia here is one of the people who really changed that. So we're really excited that you're here. So the simple and very pedestrian answer to your question is that we started by actually looking for words. We started by looking for the words that are associated with old age, zaken, kashish, sav, saba, these kinds of words, and really seeing where they come up. And oftentimes they really come up in this sort of like passing reference. Like, for example, that old man shames us. You know, it's ostensibly not part of the dynamics of the story, but we started looking for uses of these words and where they appear. And then in the second stage, we started kind of expanding our look to places in which we see a dynamics of older and younger people, which even if age is not mentioned, and by the way, the rabbis are completely not interested in chronological age. In all likelihood, most of them did not exactly know how old they were, like most people in antiquity. But we have certain stories. So if we have a story about an adult person who's dealing with their parent, there's already a dynamics of aging in that situation, even if the parent would be, you know, 50. This is not the issue. The issue is really sort of the cultural perceptions. And just as an example of that, there's a little story that appears in the Palestinian Talmud where Rabbi Judah, the patriarch, a very, very important person associated with the compilation of the Mishnah, has a debate with his son. Rabbi Judah, the patriarch, has a particular version that he likes to teach. His son has a competing version. And when he tells his son, well, that's not how I think about it, you should teach it the way I say, his son says, well, when your strength was still with you, you have taught it differently. So the word old man, zaken, or whatever, doesn't appear anywhere in that story. But if a son is telling his father, when your strength was still with you, we already understand that something's happening. So these were the kinds of dynamics that we had.
Julia, you actually had a follow-up question, and I'm not gonna read these myself. I'll let you go ahead and rephrase that yourself if you want to just follow up to that.
Well, sure. I really appreciate this. A marvelous talk, and I'm so excited to. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. I guess that this your talk is making me think about the ways in which zaken, in particular, codes, or if it codes sometimes as a kind of disability, an element of, right, does aging become particularly salient in some of these stories when certain dimensions of disability become involved? But just the conversation has made me also think about the complexity of physical versus cognitive difference, and the way that that is all playing out here. I mentioned in the chat at one point my interest in the in the Ketubot stories, because disability is so marked there in terms of the aesthetics of what bodies do you praise, who's a desirable, right? Who's the sort of desirable body at the celebration, whether that's the bride or in this case, the dancer. Alas, there's not a great question in here except to say, thank you so much. And if you want to comment about any of that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. Mira?
Hi, go ahead.
There is some, of course, it's a very complicated topic, but there is kind of what Tombs called disordered or disordered body. They refer to old age or to old people. And we have to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about old age, because usually we are talking about people who are 40, 50 years old. That's it. Like the word Saba in Aramaic, in the Talmud, is referring to old men in general. And in Hebrew, of course, it refers to grandfather. So we are dealing with a very complicated arenas in which, how to say it, the young people have to take care of their parents who are becoming old in a very, they are young in our eyes, but they are very old, and the body is deteriorating much faster than we are used to. And they are I think one of the reasons that people are afraid, or scholars did not look at old age, is because of that. Is because of it's unpleasant or complicated to look at the body in that is not whole, that is something like that. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just add about the cognitive impairment that Julia was asking about, that we actually try to step away from that kind of interpretation. It's easy because there's many cases where it seems like, you know, the old person is not of sound mind or behaving erratically or something like that. But we actually try to be careful with that, because especially with stories about older women that Haim mentioned earlier, there are some stories about older mothers who are behaving very sort of not as what would be expected from older women in rabbinic culture. And there have been some readers who said, well, you know, the mother's growing senile in the story. And we tried to say, yeah, maybe that's the easiest interpretation, but maybe we should actually interpret it as like an older person who is just breaking free of social conventions, that is rebelling against things that restricted them for all their lives. So I think there's, on the one hand, like Haim said, there's definitely issues of physical deterioration that are very prominent in the stories and undeniable. Cognitive deterioration is there as an explanation, but we actually tried not to resort to it because we felt that that would be taking a rather stigmatizing and problematic approach to old age. And as a matter of fact, I think most of the old people we met were very acute in those stories, right? Yeah.
I'll just add something to what Mira just said, that when we read like the chain of stories in Kiddushin, that I read just one story of it, the mothers are seen to be or considered to be crazy. And scholars, as well as traditional interpreters of this chain of stories, they really call them crazy. Now, when they are using the word crazy, it's because they don't want to look into the stories and to understand why they are behaving or they are not behaving, and why the rabbis or the authors of the stories wanted to describe them as crazy, or what happened to we. And when you take away the word crazy of the equation, and you ask the question why they are described like that. They're not crazy. They're just, as Mira said, they're not, I don't know, they're not, they can get out, or they can do whatever they want to do, because they're not mothers anymore, they're not in the house anymore, and they're not controlled by the public eye anymore, and especially they're not controlled. I have I don't know if it's relevant or not, but I have a very good Palestinian friend, and I went to his place a few days ago because I wanted to, it's Ramadan now. And he said women are not allowed to go to the mosque unless they are old. Old women are allowed to go to the mosque because they are not controlled anymore. And since they are not controlled, and on the other hand, men are sleeping all the time in these stories, and you can ask, it's on the other side of the question, why they are acting like crazy and why men are sleeping all the time. Because men are probably tired of controlling everybody all the time and you just want to go to sleep for a while. And women are at last free to do what they want to do, and they want to get crazy for a while. I don't know. So they are not controlled anymore. So when you move the crazy factor from the equation, you can see a complicated picture about what old age men and women can do in a very closed and tight controlled society. Something like that.
So we currently have 4 people on the stack who want to ask questions, and I'm wondering, Mira and Haim, if it might be fruitful to collect those questions so that you can weave them together as appropriate. So first, let's go ahead and hear from James Redfield, then Seth Lehrer, then Deborah Hertz, and then Jane Lazarow. So James, please.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion and book. I actually have a different question, and I wrote it up too, so I'll put it in the chat. People can refer to it. I thought it might be of more general interest. And it has to do with the theoretical possibility that, you know, technology will abolish aging, right? That someone in Silicon Valley will cure aging. And, you know, I feel like your work suggests that a lot would be lost if that happened. Because in our culture, you know, aging matters. And I wonder what your research suggests about how we would, you know, like it was said of God, create aging, you know, or invent aging, even if it didn't exist. Like, how would we make the meaning of aging happen in a culture where the physical symptoms of aging were abolished? And how do the rabbis do that? How do they think aging through non-age-related symptoms or ideas?
Mira?
Please.
I think we'll collect the questions.
Yeah, let's collect questions and then we'll let you guys weave them all together because they may be related. Seth, go ahead.
Thank you. This is a fantastic presentation. So here's my question. I'm thinking about these I'm thinking about this rabbinic texts in terms of a kind of Jewish late antiquity. And as you know, the concept of late antiquity and the period of time that we're talking about in the sort of Peter Brown version of it is very much an embodied self. And the way that Brown and his Epigones talk about the Christian body and talk about the formation of Christian theological and social authority is very much in terms of bodies in relationship to communities, questions of poverty and wealth, and also in the work on Augustine, say the awareness of the body as a kind of desiring or almost truly sexualized and also theatricalized being. So what the question that I have is really this. What strikes me about the text you're presenting here is a very fascinating parallel version of embodied spirituality and embodied religious authority. And so my question is there a sense in which these texts or these late antique rabbinic traditions are in some sense in dialogue with or response to the emerging Christian patristic traditions of embodied authority? That's my question.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
I have lots to say, but we'll wait for more questions.
So we gather 2 more, and then others that want to put themselves on stack can either write, I have a question in the comments or raise their hands. Deborah and then Jane, please. Deborah, you're muted. There we go.
Sorry, my life, I'm muted. Okay, so just for people who are far away in other cities than San Diego, I just want to say how happy we are that we hired Mira, so all her fans from far away can just drool that she's our colleague. Okay, so I have two questions. One is to go into a little bit more depth on the demography question. What was the shape, not just what was the maximum age, what was the difference between the mode and the median? Because there's a lot of misleading myths about the age of death in the Middle Ages, so I wondered how that applied. The second has to do with who's the author. In these talks, you always said they, and I presume they are not the rabbis, but some narrator. And it's my instinct there must have been multiple authors. So how do you make such confident generalizations about they, the rabbinic authorities from the 7th century to the 6th century in this Talmud, felt this way about old age? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Jane, go ahead, please. Last question in this collection, and then we will have to wrap things up fairly quickly, but we'll allow people to casually speak afterwards.
My question is a short question having to do with roles, the role of people at different ages during the time that these writings were written down, whether in old age it's a role busting time, or it's an actual fitting into what's expected.
These are such wonderful questions.
Yeah.
And now I want like 3 more hours, but we'll be concise. Thank you. These are fantastic questions. So maybe I will just start with quick responses to Deborah's questions, which I think are the most straightforward, also the most complicated, but also the most straightforward. And then we'll take some other questions, or we'll respond to the other ones.
Yeah.
I think maybe we'll save James's question for last, because that is the most philosophical and complex one. So Deborah, regarding demography. So there have been some studies done on this. So lots of people think, and I guess you refer to this as the myths related to that. People think that people in late antiquity lived to be like 30. That is misguided. The average lifespan was about, some people say 30 or 35, but the median, and it was a good thing that you brought it up, the median was 5. So the reason was that life expectancy is considered so low is because of infant mortality, which was very, very high. If you survived early childhood, you had a pretty good chance to make it to 50. You had about 10% chance to making it to 60. Although in 70 was considered like, extreme old age. So demographically speaking, we're talking about a society in which approximately 10% of the population are over 60. For the rabbis, old officially begins at 60, but they're also kind of including it before that. But this relates to James's question. I think the engagement with old age is not necessarily immediately dependent on how many old people are actually there. Old age is a cultural trope, not necessarily something that maps onto how many old people are actually there. And some people live to be 80 and 90 then too. Regarding authors, that is one of the hardest questions for anyone dealing with rabbinic literature. It is a collective literature. We do not have any single named author. It was created by a bunch of people with obviously different voices, different concerns, different ideas. We call them the rabbis because this is what we have. This is not by no means accurate. There is a lot of variety among the stories themselves, but I think there's also like one cultural world that makes it more or less legitimate to refer to them as, sort of a collective authorship. But yeah, very important point. These are not named authors, and that makes dealing with this literature quite challenging. Haim, you want to take one of the other questions?
I just want to add to Deborah's question. When we read the literature of rabbinic literature, we do not, or at least I think Mira and I cannot speak of the entire community, but we are not trying to reconstruct or say what they meant to say, or they in a way, they gave us stories, they gave us narratives, and we are reading those narratives the best way we can read them. And of course, when we say the rabbis or the Talmud or things like that, because we don't have any other words or ways to say it, but usually when we read those stories, we read them as we like to read them, and they're in a way, and I know it's complicated, but in a way they're independent. I mean, we read them. I don't know if the rabbis or the authors meant or wanted, I don't know, to say what we said about the story about the mother of Rabbi Tarfon. Maybe they thought it's a nice short story about how to respect your parents, but we read it through psychological glasses, and we do that, and we try to disconnect ourselves in a way from the original authors of the Talmud and read those stories as stories. And it's complicated because, of course, we have the historical questions, we have philological questions. It's like a complicated dance between how we read literature and how we read history, I think.
That's a challenge, by the way, of working a history person and a literature person. It was constantly this, like, I'm saying, can we really say this? And Haim says, of course we can say it, it's literature. And so, yes, which was really fun. Haim, do you want to maybe speak to Seth's question about the dialogue with Christianity and modes of authority, in embodied authority, because that relates exactly to our gaze, to the visual piety?
It's we deal it directly in the book with the question of Christian gaze and what Peter Brown wrote about it, and the gaze, or how we look, and how would I say it, they emphasized, or they put a lot of attention to the status, to the way people are looking at the body, or paying attention to the body, and the way, for instance, in rabbinic literature, when you cannot see, you cannot teach. And if you cannot see your rabbi, you cannot study from your rabbi. And if your rabbi cannot see, for instance, the Rabbi Yochanan that we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, this old guy, the head of this old rabbi, the head of the Tiberias Academy, he wasn't really blind, but he couldn't see. And the fact that he couldn't see his students and meant that he is not capable of being a rabbi anymore. Seeing your students or making your student be able to see you enables you to teach or to study. When you the image, in a way, the image of the sage is something like the image of God. And the fact that, for instance, Rabbi Yochanan is considered to be a very pretty man. He is one of the few people that is mentioned, or the rabbis refer to him as a pretty man, and he's used to be very pretty. And the fact that his students are looking at him, and he knows that they're not seeing anymore a pretty, handsome man anymore, but they're seeing an old, deteriorating body, is a fact that shapes the whole scene. Now, I don't know if that gives you a full answer to your question, and maybe Mira wants to add something to that, but the emphasis in Christian culture at the beginning, and at the first centuries, is reflected in rabbinic literature. We call it the visual turn. All of a sudden, in the first, second, third, until the 4th century, the image of the sage or the saint, depends on if you are in Christian or Jewish culture, is very important of understanding the relationship between, in rabbinic literature, the sage or the rabbi and his students.
So, yeah, I will just to add to what Haim just described, there is definitely, I think, a shared, I don't want to call it influence, and I'm not sure it's a direct dialogue, but there's definitely a shared semiotic space between early Christianity and rabbinic and Jewish rabbinic culture, in which the body is the site in which religious piety happens, 100%, both in terms of one's own practice and in terms of the saint or the sage. So absolutely, old age is a big deal, partially because of this idea that piety and relationship with God is something that is in the body, for sure. And we do address that to some extent. Quick answer to the question about roles of old people and role busting and all of that. That's also, as a matter of fact, the last chapter of our book is specifically about that. It is about the changing roles or rolelessness in old age. And presumably, according to what rabbinic texts construct, yes, old people do have a role in their old age. And their role is to serve sort of as a collective memory of the community. Their role is to remember halachic traditions. Their role is to remember events. Their role is to sort of land out that memory that they have when needed, and not to expect any kind of recognition, not to expect, it would be, if we compare it to academic terms, and obviously as academics we're thinking a lot with it, it would be like, you are the one who is supposed to know a bunch of scholarship, but you yourself never get cited. So that would be, I would say, the equivalent, that there is an expectation that old age sort of emerge into old people become anonymous, don't expect to be recognized by their name, don't expect to be recognized as people who have something to something substantial to contribute of their own, but they hold together the memory of the community. And we actually discuss some stories of old people who are kind of pushed into that role and resent it and say, like, I don't want to just be the memory apparatus. I want to be me. I want to maintain my name. I want to maintain my identity. And finally, to James's question about technology that would cancel old age, I got to tell you, if that would exist, I'm signing up for it. Personally, I think that it definitely has some advantages to offer. You are absolutely right that old age is not just, a biological fact or a chronological fact or a psychological fact, and none of those things is necessarily corresponding with each other. It's also a very important way in which we construct our society and make sense of our life and make sense of our communities. And what will we do to make sense of our communities if it does not exist? I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, but I can tell you one thing. I think we already live in a society that is culturally not calibrated for the life expectancy. The fact that, in Israel, for example, or in other countries that have mandatory retirement, the retirement age is 65 or 70. It presents a completely different notion of what is life expectancy than it is today, and of what people in their 70s and oftentimes 80s actually feel like and how they experience themselves. So we already live in a situation that is not in sync with what we have. And that's something we have to figure out as a society. But yeah, if we could have the bodies of 30-year-olds, I have no opposition to that.
Yeah.
Thank you. This is fantastic. I am going to, because it's already 11:15, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but I will leave the Zoom open. And I think we can transition into a more casual conversation at this point, something that approximates, coming up to the podium and introducing yourselves to the speakers and just chatting and checking in. But unless there are any sort of last words that either of you wanted to get out before I actually stop that.
Thank you.
Just to thank you. Yeah.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting the whole event. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
This was fantastic. I have a million questions, but in the interest of time, I'll wait and ask them of you later. But thank you so much.